Today's lesson will cover Chapter 3, Key Issue 2, Where do people migrate within a country? In the first part, we're going to take on interregional migration in the United States. Second, interregional migration in other large countries. And lastly, intra-regional migration. Remember, interregional migration is the permanent movement from one region of a country to another, and intra-regional migration is the permanent movement within one region of a country. An example of interregional migration would be moving from the Midwest of the United States to California. An example of intra-regional migration would be moving from Sacramento to Folsom. This would be an example of moving from an urban area, which might be considered Sacramento, to a suburban area, which would be considered Folsom. Both are part of the region of Sacramento County. Let's take a look at Figure 3-12, located on page 87 of your textbook. This looks at the changing center of U.S. population. The U.S. center of population has moved westward and south. Movement reflects changing transportation and economies. Let's break down each of these eras. The population center is the average location of everyone in the country, the center of population gravity. If the United States were a flat plane placed on top of a pin and each individual weighted the same, the population center would be the point where the population distribution causes the flat plane to balance on the head of the pin. Please note that the U.S. Census Bureau computes the country's population center at the time of each census. You'll notice that a census is happening in 2020, as the census is taken every 10 years. This map will help us understand how interregional migration has happened throughout history. Let's first take on 1790. Colonial-era settlements were near the Atlantic coast, and colonists depended on the shipping links with Europe to receive products and to export raw materials. The Appalachian Mountains also blocked Western development because of steep slopes, thick forests, and few gaps that allowed easy passage. Also, the indigenous Native Americans occupied large areas and sometimes resisted the expansion of settlement. Most population at this time hugged the coast. Now let's look at 1800 to 1840. Transportation improvements, especially the building of canals, helped to open the interior. People were encouraged by the opportunity to obtain a large amount of land at a low price. They cut down trees and used the wood to build homes, barns, and fences. This time frame is characterized by people willing to cross the Appalachians. The next time frame is 1850 to 1890, and folks are moving westward to rush for gold. The population center shifted west more rapidly around this period, and rather than continuing to expand agriculture in the West, mid-19th century pioneers kept going all the way to California, mainly to mine for gold. Next, we can look at 1900 to 1940. This is where we see the filling in of the Great Plains. The westward movement of the U.S. population center actually slowed during this period because emigration from Europe to the East Coast offset most of the emigration from the East Coast to the U.S. West. Also, immigrants began to fill in the Great Plains that earlier generations had bypassed. Advances in agricultural technology enabled people to cultivate the area. Lastly, we're going to take a look at 1950 to 2010. During this time frame, you're still going to see many people migrating west, but you're also going to see a considerable part of the population moving to the southern region of the country. Americans are now moving south for job opportunities and warmer climate. Many would say that this migration has led to a little bit of hostility between the South and the Northeast and Midwest regions of the United States. This is because some believe that the southern states have stolen industries from these regions. However, when we look at most of the South's industrial growth, it actually comes from newly established companies. A major recession that occurred between 2008 and 2009 discouraged people from migrating because of the limited job prospects in all regions. So we have seen migration slow down, but it has started to pick up within the last few years. This map will show the different regions that are considered to make up the United States. Check out what states make up the West, the Midwest, the South, and the Northeast. This figure, 3-13, can be found on page 87 of your textbook. It indicates interregional migration in the United States. Figures will show the flow of migrants in thousands of people in 2012 and 2013. As you'll see, the most recent net migration trends are to the south. Now that we've looked at interregional migration patterns in the United States, we're going to compare that to interregional migration in other parts of the world. First, let's look at interregional migration of Canada. Figure 3-14 on page 88 of your textbook will show that almost all of net in-migration is experienced by the Western provinces. Canada, just like the United States, has had interregional migration primarily from the east to the west for nearly 2 centuries. Since 2001, the 2 westernmost provinces, Alberta and British Columbia, have had nearly all of Canada's net in-migration, whereas Ontario has had the largest net out-migration. Many job opportunities have pulled people westward, and much of it can be attributed to the large amount of oil money that is present in the West, as well as trade routes that have been established on the West Coast as well. You'll also see a larger influx of international migration in the West as well. Figure 3-15, located on page 89 of your textbook, it's going to be looking at interregional migration of Russia. Russia's interregional migration patterns show the reversal of earlier attempts to populate the Asian regions, now coming back to the West. During the height of the Soviet Union period, communist policy encouraged factory construction near raw materials rather than near population concentrations. Because many of the raw materials were located in remote portions of Asia, the Soviet government sometimes forced people to move to these regions in order to have an adequate supply of labor. In recent years, however, interregional migration has reversed, with net in-migration to the European regions where the largest cities and job opportunities are clustered. So again, to recap, people were forced to move east to mine and work factories, but currently we're seeing more people move west to the European side of Russia because there's more wealth and job opportunities. Now let's look at interregional migration of China. This is figure 3-16 and it's located on page 89 of your textbook. Here we actually see that migrants are heading eastward toward the major cities along the East Coast where job opportunities are most abundant. The reason we see people migrating east along the coast is because this is where job opportunities are available and people are moving from the rural areas to the urban areas that are along the East Coast. Lastly, we're going to be looking at interregional migration of Brazil. This is figure 3-17, also located on page 89 of your textbook. Just like China, most Brazilians live in a string of large cities near the East Coast. This has a lot to do with Brazil's tropical interior that's sparsely inhabited. In an attempt to increase the attractiveness of the interior, the government of Brazil moved its capital in 1960 from Rio to a newly built city called Brasilia. This new capital was situated 1,000 kilometers, which is 600 miles from the Atlantic coast. Because of this influence of the government, the coastal areas now have net out migration, whereas the interior areas have net in migration. The last part of Key Issue 2 is going to cover intra-regional migration. Remember, interregional migration is from region to region, And intra-regional migration is migration within a region. When we look at intra-regional migration, we know that rural to urban migration is most common in our developing countries. Instead, we see that urban to suburban migration is more common in developed countries. But we're also going to talk about people moving from urban areas back to rural areas, also known as counter-urbanization, and we can observe this in some cases as well. Let's take a look at this map of India. This is 3-19 located on page 90 of your textbook, and it's going to demonstrate internal migration. Net migration within India has been primarily from rural to urban states. Most of the migration patterns on this map are going from states that are less than 20% urban to states that are more than 30% urban. As with interregional migrants, most people who move from rural to urban areas seek economic advancement. They are pushed from the rural areas by declining opportunities in agriculture and are pulled to the cities by the prospect of work in factories or in-service industries. Looking closely at this map, we see migration flows in India are mostly from rural states that are green to more urbanized states in the dark brown. Now we can compare the intra-regional migration in India to that of intra-regional migration in the United States. Here we see that intra-regional migration is primarily from cities to suburbs. This is figure 3-20 located on page 91 of your textbook. Nearly twice as many Americans migrate from the cities to suburbs each year as migrate from the suburbs to cities. These patterns are prevalent in Europe as well as Canada. The major reason for the large-scale migration to the suburbs is not related to employment, as is the case with other forms of migration. Most people migrate to suburbs because of lifestyle. Suburbs offer the opportunity to live in a detached house rather than an apartment, surrounded by a private yard where children can play safely. A garage or a driveway on the property guarantees space to park cars at no extra charge. In the US, suburban schools tend to be more modern, better equipped, and safer than those in the cities. Cars and trains have enabled people to live in suburbs, yet still have their jobs, shops, and recreational facilities in urban areas. Developed countries witnessed a new migration trend beginning in the late 20th century. For the first time, more people immigrated into rural areas than emigrated out of them. The net migration from urban to rural areas is called counter-urbanization. It is important to note that it is a little difficult to determine where a suburb ends and countryside begins. But counter-urbanization represents a genuine migration from cities and suburbs to small towns and rural communities. As with suburbanization, people move from urban to rural areas for lifestyle reasons. Some people find it desirable to move to rural areas for the prospect of swapping the frantic pace of urban lifestyles for the opportunity to live on a farm where they can own horses and grow their own vegetables. Other people may be living in rural areas or even on a farm, but still work outside of agriculture. They may actually travel to work to nearby offices, small town shops, or other services. Much of the counter-urbanization that we see in the United States is happening in states like Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. Keep in mind that with modern communication and transportation systems, no location in a developed country is truly isolated, either economically or socially. We can buy most of our products online and have them delivered within a few days. We can follow the fortunes of our favorite teams anywhere in the country. And thanks to cable, satellite, and webcasts, we can do just about anything, anywhere. A few important things to note. Intra-regional migration in the US has slowed considerably since the 1980s. Most interregional migration in the US still continues to be between cities and suburbs, but since 2010, the number of Americans moving from cities to suburbs has decreased. That is because cities have become more attractive, especially to younger people. Younger people especially are moving to the cities. And we can attribute a lot of this to the fact that many of them are deciding not to have families, are starting much later, and are able to live in smaller areas where there's an availability of services like bars, restaurants, and other amenities. This has in large part led to gentrification, which we will cover in a later chapter.